Welcome to the first session of the conflict management course. Today we will discuss what team conflicts are. Why is this necessary? This information and knowledge is essential for everyone. Someone who knows how to resolve conflicts is a very valuable person. I have called them an indispensable element for any business. Companies are especially interested in retaining such people by any means necessary. Because conflicts are part of any company or business, and someone who knows how to handle them properly is truly important. Here is our course website. At the end it simply says conflict, very straightforward. Even if you do not have the link handy, you can remember and find it, or locate it on the Academy's homepage. If we have not met yet, my name is Mike Petula, and I have been dealing with conflicts probably since I started working. At Alpha Bank, during its period of active growth and establishment as a progressive bank, of course at Starlight Media where I worked with creative staff. Those who have worked with creative people in television know that conflict is the foundation of the work. Why? Because conflict is built into the rules of dramaturgy. People watch television because it follows the rules of dramaturgy, and all dramaturgy is built around conflict. Wargaming also had many conflicts. Of course, game dev is also developing a computer game about battles and wars. Well, it is a startup, the least conflict-prone of the organizations I have observed, but there were still some misunderstandings. Ideal is also calmer, and now I am teaching at the Academy. The work relies on global best practices. Here is a list of what I recommend you subscribe to as well. Okay, there is a comment here. Anastasia wrote, "This topic is very relevant. Today the team faced one big conflict. I assigned a task to a new manager. He reacted negatively and said, 'Only the supervisor will assign tasks to me, and I am junior to her by half.'" I see. Yes, this happens quite often. Thank you for sharing your cases. Well, let's move on. I see many have already written. If you'd like, share your city, position, and company. This is how we'll get to know each other. You'll introduce yourselves. It's always interesting. So whoever is ready, write, and as soon as you do, I'll read it out. For those already in the course, remember you have homework. Just a reminder, we only give diplomas to those who do well and learn effectively. That's why our diplomas are trusted. Our course program has 6 sessions. Today we're introducing the topic, but even though it's an introduction, we'll learn a lot, even about conflict resolution. In future sessions, we'll dive deeper for those interested. In the second session, we'll break down different types of conflicts. In the third, we'll work carefully with the causes of conflicts. In the fourth, we'll study conflict situations and how to handle them in a company. In the fifth, we'll discuss how to prevent them, and in the sixth, how to resolve them. That's the plan. In today's open session, we'll discuss what conflict consists of, why it's inherent to humans, why we shouldn't avoid or fear it. We'll talk about the psychology of conflicts and typical causes of conflicts. That's our plan for today. So conflict. The word conflict comes from the Latin conflictus, meaning clash, like many words. In many languages besides Russian and Ukrainian, the word conflict is preserved in exactly the same form, so it's natural for all of us, generally speaking. What are the characteristics of conflict? Typically, there are contradictions between interests, which is very important, values, goals, and motives of the parties. If you think of a recent conflict right now, ask yourself, what was it? Was it a conflict of interests, values, goals, or motives? Just think about it for yourself. Yulia wrote Moscow marketing sales. Thank you, Yulia. Next. The second characteristic is opposition between subjects. Opposition usually involves some events that occur, some actions that are demonstrated. Next is the desire to inflict maximum damage on the opponent's interests by any means. This is also a characteristic of conflict. That's exactly why many people avoid conflicts, why many want to resolve conflicts, because companies want to avoid material damage, and this is accompanied by negative emotions and feelings towards each other. So this is also a characteristic of conflict. As we can see from a business perspective, from the company's point of view, there's little benefit here. Yes, it's bad when a company has differing interests, values, goals, and motives. It's better to have them synchronized. It's bad when there's opposition. It's bad when there's a desire to harm each other. And it's bad when people experience negative emotions. Here we're talking more about conflict in the classical sense, because now it's very popular to talk about constructive conflict. Perhaps due to a lack of words in Russian, Ukrainian, and other languages, they couldn't find a good term for constructive conflict and just called it conflict as well. In this course, we're talking more about classic conflicts, which are very far from being constructive. So conflict is a clash or confrontation between parties, where at least one party perceives the other's actions as a threat to its interests. Without that perception, I just treat the other person calmly, condescendingly, casually, normally. It's hard to have a conflict when one person is waving their fists while the other just stands there watching. It's important that one party perceives the other's actions as a threat to their interests. What are the components of a conflict? A conflict has parties. There's Vasya and Petya. These are the parties to the conflict. There are conditions in which the conflict occurs. For example, it happens at work, in the context of working on some project. There's a subject of conflict. For instance, Sasha wants to use Trello, Vasya wants to use Asana. There are actions of the conflict participants. They do something. They tell the supervisor that the other person is bad. And there's the outcome or result of the conflict, how it all gets resolved. That's what will happen in the end. These are the structural components of a conflict. Let's move on. The subject of the conflict. This is what we had as the subject of conflict. This is essentially what people fight over, what becomes the object of the struggle between parties, and it's usually related to mutually exclusive goals of the conflicting parties, or at least the goals of one of them. If the parties quickly realize, which is usually not difficult, that their goals don't exclude each other. You want red, I want warm, so that means it doesn't conflict, it's fine. We can have both red and warm. But if there's an understanding that the goals conflict, then a conflict arises. Stages. How does conflict develop? First, an objective situation arises, either conflictual or pre-conflictual. The participants, the parties, recognize this situation as conflictual and start to get involved. Then the conflict occurs, meaning conflictual interaction, and eventually the conflict is resolved sooner or later, or the conflict can become dormant and linger. Or maybe not so dormant, it could be very long-term. Meanwhile, the parties continue to cause each other material damage. Therefore, prolonged conflicts are the most dangerous and harmful. And prolonged conflicts can even destroy a company. If parties in a company have been damaging each other for a very long time, the company is likely to suffer as a result. It's important to understand that conflicts are part of human nature. Well, we were programmed or created this way, however you want to look at it, but it's part of our nature. We were designed this way. If we didn't engage in conflicts, we could die very quickly. Any animal or other creature could take everything we have, I don't know, eat it and so on. That's because, for example, a tiger has a very clear interest in having dinner. The tiger's interest doesn't quite align with our own interest of surviving, or maybe having the tiger for dinner. And so a conflict arises. If we didn't have conflict built into our nature, we would see a tiger and say, well, okay, you want to eat me? Go ahead. And that would be the end of that person. So nature, or whatever you want to call it, created us with conflict as part of our essence. And here I'd like to offer a small self-reflection question. I hope you'll be honest. On a scale of 10, how would you rate your own tendency to engage in conflicts? 10 points means you're a very conflictual person. You constantly have arguments with other people every day, many times a day. 0 points means you're not a confrontational person at all. You give in easily. A stranger could walk up to you, take your phone out of your hand, walk away, and you'd say, oh, well, whatever. Okay, 4, 5, 2. Let's have 5, 6 more. Okay, 3, 4. Friends, I'll say that 2 points might not be very good for you. I would recommend you take a course. This course will be helpful. A course on how to engage in conflict. 6, 4. For example, I was also a non-confrontational person for a long time, until I realized that being non-confrontational was harmful, and I learned how to engage in constructive conflict. And you know, I even started to see some benefits from it. I saw that there are situations that can't be resolved without conflict. For instance, when I lived in Belarus, I often had to cross the border, and various situations would arise at the border. If I had continued to be conflict averse, I would have lost a lot of time there. But when I deliberately engaged in controlled, managed, constructive conflict, I achieved faster border crossings. There were different situations, nothing criminal. For example, someone would cut in line in front of me, or they would check someone and stop the whole line, spending all their time and energy checking one person, instead of checking that person while letting other people pass in parallel. Well, many things like that. So just for thought, those who give themselves 2 points should also consider this. Okay, let's move on. Circumstances that contribute to team conflict. That is, there are situations in which conflicts may appear more frequently. The first is a period of quickly achieved successes. When a company or team achieves success very quickly, many successful startups, if they're founded by a few people, start to quarrel. They created something together, it started to grow, and then oops, they couldn't share and started fighting. Uncertainty in assessing the balance of power when they didn't realize who was who. For example, there's a relative of the CEO or a shareholder on the team, but someone doesn't fully realize it right away. It's an offensive comparison when someone unfavorably compares someone to another person. Status uncertainty when it's unclear who has what status. All or nothing thinking. Weakening of rules and norms. This is a very important part. If lawlessness reigns in a company with no rules, principles, or described culture, conflicts will occur there. People don't know what's acceptable, what's not, what's good, or what's bad. Communication between group members and the presence of individuals capable of becoming leaders. These are called informal leaders. These are all circumstances that contribute to team conflict. Even casual socializing. I mean, there are teams where people don't socialize much. They can delegate tasks to each other with minimal communication. There are teams with a lot of communication. Conflicts will occur more often there. Therefore, all of these factors can contribute to team conflict. As you can see, there's a lot of work-related stuff, a lot you can observe in a team every day. Types. We can categorize conflicts into two main types, accidental conflicts and non-accidental conflicts. How do accidental conflicts arise? The first conflict agent appears. Well, we'll define that a bit later, something like that. So something you might say an irritant, the first irritant appears. In response to this first conflict agent, a stronger reciprocal conflict agent manifests. For example, one person says, "You're an idiot." And the other replies, "You're not just an idiot, you're blah, blah, blah." An even stronger reciprocal conflict agent and conflict arises. For instance, if you've seen a conflict situation on the road where one car cuts off another, the other car overtakes the first one, cutting it off even more aggressively. The first driver starts honking, leaning out the window and yelling. The second driver jumps out of the car and starts attacking the first one. The first driver grabs a tire iron or baseball bat from the car and starts beating the second one. That's how the conflict spirals, with each subsequent action usually being stronger than the previous one. These are random conflicts, where some kind of conflict manifests. It's some irritating event that causes a person to react more aggressively. It's useful to think about what would be a conflict trigger for you. This is a question for you to ponder. Just something spontaneous that comes to mind that might set you off. Think about it, write it down. At home, at work, on the road, it doesn't matter. Just the first thing that comes to mind. What could set you off? When you start responding with stronger conflict triggers, you're likely to respond more aggressively, more confrontationally, more proactively than you were provoked. For example, an insult. If someone insults me, I might insult them back even harder. But that's just a thought. It's not certain, of course, there will be many nuances. So for example, negligence, devaluing, or blatant injustice. By the way, injustice is a topic that bothers many people, including myself. It can be hurtful. All right, who else is willing to share? Who's not willing to share even for themselves? Think about it, it's useful. Injustice, like when a taxi driver goes the wrong way. But maybe the taxi driver is avoiding traffic, right? Okay, let's move on. Conflict triggers. I'll later give a link to an author who has done a lot of work in conflict management. I'll recommend his book. But for now, we'll just familiarize ourselves with the situations, without names or anything else. Another option is the unwillingness to negotiate, stubbornly pushing one's agenda in business without arguments. Oh, personal insults, physical attacks. So conflict triggers are like viruses of random conflicts. They can be words. You know, there's a notion that a word can be more powerful than an action, actions, or even inaction. Inaction can also offend us, affect us somehow, make us angry. For example, if an action is expected, how does it happen? The car in front stops, the light turns green. We need to go, but the car doesn't move. It's common for drivers to say, come on. So inaction can also provoke a more active response. Well, expectation versus reality, expectation and inaction. All of these can lead to conflict. Therefore, a conflict trigger is a random variable, just like a virus. A virus is also a random variable. It may or may not lead to illness. That happens too. It depends on the random coincidence of various circumstances. We typically respond to a conflict trigger directed at us with an even stronger one, usually stronger. The theoretical basis for the law of conflict trigger escalation is the psychological mechanisms of spontaneous tension increase. Psychologists have determined that we have an inherent mechanism. As I said, we have a conflictual nature. It's our nature. Nature has designed us to spontaneously escalate tension. Probably to help us resolve conflicts. Probably for survival. We have many things ingrained for survival. Apparently, people with this in their DNA survived more, so they produced you and me. So here's how to prevent conflicts from arising when we don't want to create them where they're not needed. But again, I'll reiterate, knowing how to avoid conflicts, how not to create them, and how to manage them, this knowledge can also be used to create conflicts if you need them. I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with conflicts. It's important to understand how they work. If you know that not using conflict triggers will lead to avoidance, then conversely, using conflict triggers will lead to creating conflict. If you need to provoke a conflict with someone to resolve a work or personal situation, you know you need to use a conflict trigger, either a word or an action. But be careful. You know how children are warned. If you pick up matches, be careful with them. That's what I'm warning you about. If you learn how to work with conflicts in this class and course for your own benefit, be extremely careful with it. So, if your goal or task is to behave without conflict, rule number 1 is don't use conflict triggers. I think you're already starting to understand what these are through examples. We'll clarify this as much as possible in the course. Next, don't respond to conflict triggers with more conflict triggers. In other words, evaluate the situation. Something happened, you caught a conflict trigger directed at you, an action, inaction, or a word. Ask yourself a question. Do I need to escalate this further or not? If you don't need this conflict, then don't. I'll tell you about a situation today when I didn't use a conflict trigger and didn't react. So I had a meeting this morning. Downtown was very packed with cars and I had to park in a place where I shouldn't have really parked. Well, you know how it is in the city, there aren't enough parking spots, so you park where you can. I justified it to myself. I parked in a spot where a car was leaving. I was looking for a place to park. A car was pulling out and I thought, oh, if it's leaving, I automatically assume I can park there. Anyway, I'm in the meeting and my car alarm goes off. My phone rings to alert me. I go out to see who set it off, who it bothered. There's some guy standing there. I ask if he accidentally triggered the alarm. He says no. And then another guy in a car pulls up and says, is this miracle yours? I say, it's mine. He calmly says, it's yours. He says, do you know you can't park here? I ask, where did you come from? He says he came from this building. It was the alarm going off. Yes, I kicked the tire, he says. I say, thank you for kicking the tire and not somewhere else. He says you can't park here. There's an exit from the building right here. I say, this is the last time I'm here. I'm just a casual visitor and won't be coming back. You don't need to worry anymore. And I see this calms him down. He doesn't know what to say. I say, well, I didn't know your rules. I didn't realize I couldn't park here. So I apologize for parking here. I said all this jokingly, good-naturedly, without any loss of dignity. He was taken aback, smiled, got in his car and drove off. I could have said, what are you doing hitting my car, you jerk? For example, I could have insulted him verbally or gone and kicked his car. That would have been an action. Or I could have done nothing, just stood there staring at him, angering him with inaction. Here, the choice was not to respond to conflict triggers with more conflict triggers. Next, look at the situation through the eyes of the other person. In my situation, I realized he probably lives here and this parking spot isn't seen as convenient for the residents. They walk by here, there's a car parked, it's unpleasant. That was the case in my situation. Show as much goodwill as possible. In my case, I smiled at him. I explained that I was just a one-time visitor, that I wouldn't be coming back here, and that I didn't know the rules and didn't mean to break them, and I even apologized. I kindly understood that, well, why not apologize? the person was upset about his yard, I would be upset too. I also have an understanding of where you can and can't park in my yard. If someone parked where I think they shouldn't, I would be upset. And to prevent the emergence of conflict triggers, provide proactive explanations. This is an advanced technique. It's a bit in the realm of manipulating people. In fact, manipulating people is part of everyone's life. We start doing it from birth. From birth, when we want something, we start to cry. We want to be given something sweet, for example, and to be picked up. We just cry until we get what we want. We manipulate people. That's how nature made us. And so here too, since nature created us as manipulators, we have to do it. Now you can do this with people too. You can do things so that conflicts don't arise. You can explain things to people even if some actions have already occurred. For example, you provoke a conflict, some conflict agent flies back at you, and you start explaining, or you did as you created an agent conflict and immediately explain to the person. Or even before you've done that, you explain, you say, for example, to your coworkers, for example, you're a manager, you have employees. Look, I'm an emotional person and I'm going to train you, I don't know what, to work with emotional people. I will occasionally raise my voice at you so that you learn how to respond to customers who raise their voices. So if I raise my voice at you, don't react aggressively, speak calmly, lower and quieter. But this is, of course, a situation like this. You're thinking on a situation-by-situation basis. It can be its own preemptive clarification, but this technique can work. Let's move on. Classification of gene conflict. Why they occur, how they can be categorized. Somewhere it's a drive for superiority. There are some people who have a psychological need to show superiority. Again, there's a lot of nature in all of this and a lot of psychology. I think you've met people like that too. And even on the road a lot, a man is driving and he needs to show superiority. Or maybe that's the kind of person you are. Think about it. Next, somewhere there's an aggressive behavior. And self-gratification at the expense of the weak, for sure. Somewhere this manifestation is aggressive. So there are people who are aggressive, again, for various reasons. Maybe the person, someone has pissed him off, maybe he's burning out, maybe he's unhappy about something. Somewhere it's selfish. Yeah, I don't give a damn about you. I'm here now and I'm not interested in anything at all. You can't stop here. That's what I've decided. Somewhere it's a violation of the rules. So a person breaks the rules, and that's how I broke the rules of the residents of the yards today, the residents of the houses of this yard. It created a conflict of agent between us, or the unfavorable course of circumstances. That's important to realize too. I mean, maybe it just happens to be a conflictogenic thing between us. Let's move on. How do you tame the conflict prone? Logically, trying not to do that doesn't show your superiority. And people who are excellent manipulators, they usually even show you that they are kind of beneath you by level in order not to show their superiority, to curb their aggressiveness and measure their selfishness. Or conversely, if you want to create a conflict situation, show the other person that you are superior. Stop behaving aggressively and selfishly, and you'll have a conflict on your hands. And he decided to take it out on my car. Maybe everyone parks every day. He goes through this quietly every day, and just today he decided to car bump the car for a tire fight. So we don't know, but it was an accidental one. This is how a non-accidental conflict arises. A non-random conflict develops in a more complex way, and according to a slightly different formula, according to a different algorithm. Non-accidental conflict has a conflict situation that I precede the conflict. Then there is an incident that is events, and that is the result. We have a conflict. That is, there was a situation, it did not manifest itself in any way, and then we have a conflict. Or there may be another way when conflict situations accumulate, then the incident is no longer needed, the conflict happens on its own. A conflict situation could be, we'll talk further in a moment, some dissatisfaction, some disagreement. But it's missing some kind of event to trigger it. As it piles up, we say our cup of patience is overflowing. It means we had a conflict situation that had been brewing for a long time, and then some incident finally resolved it. So I've talked a few times before about constructive conflict, that maybe some of you might want to run conflict. I meant rather than random conflict, then it's unlikely you'd want to create a problem for yourself out of the blue, but rather you'd want some sort of conflict situation and decide to take advantage of some conflict to resolve it accordingly. For this conflict scenario, resolving the conflict would mean eliminating the conflict situation itself and ending the incident. If a conflict situation is not avoidable, conflict can be prevented by avoiding incidents. For example, you live with neighbors, such as wall-to-wall neighbors on the same floor, and you and your neighbors no more kind of support different politicians. In Americans, you are for Democrats and your neighbors are for Republicans. It's a conflict situation. You want different parties, different presidents to come to power. What's not a conflict situation? Great conflict situation. You can change the parties to soccer teams or, I don't know, something else. So it is possible to not create conflict by avoiding incidents. For example, don't play loud music. Because if you turn the music up loud, it's an incident that creates conflict. But not because you played the music loudly. Maybe loud music doesn't bother anyone, but because you support the Republicans and allow yourself to play loud music, you definitely need to be put in your place. So resolving a conflict situation means changing your views, for example, or convincing your neighbors to change their views, which is probably unlikely. And to end the incident, turn off the loud music or avoid playing loud music in the first place. Let's move on. The concept of a conflict situation is an accumulation of contradictions. When it built up little by little over time, an incident is a clash between parties, an unpleasant occurrence caused by some action or statement. Generally speaking, words and actions, as we've discussed before, can lead to conflict when perceived by the other party as threatening their interests. For example, the neighbors think he turned up the music loudly because he wants to humiliate Republicans, and conflict is open confrontation. These are the three concepts. Let's move on. An algorithm for conflict resolution. Now let's get familiar with it. A conflict situation is a diagnosis of a disease in relationships called conflict. Treatment of any disease is only effective with a correct diagnosis. So establishing a diagnosis is the first step in treatment. That is, you may be a party to a conflict in a work or life situation. You've had some kind of incident and you're trying to resolve it. But it turns out you don't need to resolve the situation. You need to understand why the conflict situation arose in the first place. Imagine this story with your neighbors and Republicans, and you're for the Democrats, for example, and they know you're a Democrat, you support the Democrats, not the Republicans, but you don't know that. You think they also support the Democrats. So you blasted the music, they came running, called the police, and so on. If you don't know that your conflict situation was created by belief in different political parties, then you'll be trying to resolve the wrong conflict. So here's a question for you. Think of someone you have a conflict with, and consider on a scale of 1 to 10 how well you understand the essence of the conflict situation between you. We're not looking at specific recent events, but the overall conflict situation. That is why the person is always ready to react, well, not always, but sometimes react aggressively towards you. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your understanding of this diagnosis with them, understanding why they might react that way? Give a score in points. Yes, for example, 10 points. I clearly understand our conflict situation. He's for this and I'm for that, so it can lead to conflict. Okay, I see a score of 8 here, another 8, 9, and another 8. I'm also curious how well you understand the conflict situations that can lead to conflicts if incidents occur or if they accumulate into conflict situations. So basically, here's another 9. Based on your ratings, this isn't some hidden, closed, or unknown information for you. This is understandable information for you, which is great. Here's another rating. I mean, if many of you had given a score of 0 or 1, I would immediately say that you then need to try to analyze, talk, study, gather information about what the essence of the conflict situation is. So the rule for formulating a conflict situation. A key role in resolving non-random conflicts is played by competent constructive formulation of conflict situations describing the essence of any conflict. If you see that you have problems with someone, a useful solution might be to write down the essence of the conflict situation on paper, specifically write it down on paper, because we have a lot in our heads at the level of emotions, perceptions, intuition, and when we put it into words, it's easier to work with. So that's the recommendation. If there's a person you'd like to improve relations with and you often conflict, try to formulate the conflict situation with them in words as a description. Accordingly, rule number 1, a conflict situation is what needs to be eliminated. Rule number 2, it precedes the incident and the conflict. That is, you describe not what happened but why it happened, what came before. Rule number 3, the way you formulate it should make clear who needs to do what to resolve the conflict situation. This is the most difficult part because everyone's conflict situations are different. So it can be challenging here, but determination can overcome this. Rule number 4, ask yourself why. Why is this happening? For example, a conflict situation. My good friend is envious of my success. It's hard to understand how to eliminate this. The question is, why is he envious of my success? And there can be very different answers here. You may need to ask yourself why several times until you get to the root cause. He's envious of my success because he saw me win in this category and he didn't win it. But why is he envious? Because he wants to win in such a category. But why does he want to win? Well, asking why several times may lead you to some very unexpected conclusions. Rule number 5, formulate the conflict situation in your own words. Don't use someone else's words, write it your own way and try to keep it minimal. If you have a description of the conflict situation that's several paragraphs long, try to condense it down to 1 or 2 clear sentences. Let's move on. An algorithm for identifying all the component elements of any conflict. First, you need to determine if there is a conflict. And if you see that you have a conflict with someone, start exploring what the conflict situations are. There may be several. Ask yourself the question, is there any other conflict situation in this conflict? Is there any other conflict situation? Until you say that's it, there's definitely nothing else. Again, of course, you're relying a lot on your assumptions here, but that's good because you don't have other information, and this information will help you. It will be the key to the solution. Now, the reasons for conflicts in a team. In this course, we'll examine different types of conflicts within a team, between teams, between a manager and an employee, and so on. So here are just a few examples, a preview, so to speak, of what could happen. And for understanding, especially for HR, it's particularly helpful because understanding the causes can lead to solutions. For example, unclear distribution of rights and responsibilities when roles are not clearly assigned or defined can lead to conflict. Improper actions by one or more team members. Situational incompatibility between 2 or more people. Differences of opinion, personal dislike, maybe envy, psychological incompatibility. These are the kinds of reasons that can create conflicts in a team. Next are the types of team conflicts. It could be between a leader and the team. It could be between a regular team member and the team. It could be between a leader and a subgroup. And here too, there can be various possible reasons that will lead to this. In class, we'll study the different types of conflicts and their possible causes in detail. Next, how to prevent conflicts in a team, something that many people at work are interested in, especially HR and managers. First of all, it's cohesion, which increases the effectiveness of activities and the comfort and well-being of its participants. This is why many companies have team-building events. For example, when I worked at Wargaming, we had company rules. Each manager was allocated an annual budget, which was usually enough for 2 team-building events. There were also general corporate events, meaning a lot was really being done for cohesion. And it really did help reduce conflicts. Often these team-building events were done cross-team. That is, one team with another team, or individual members were invited from other teams, specifically to increase cohesion. So that's why all these team-building events are held. If you don't know why they're held, here's one argument. It's to increase cohesion and reduce conflict situations. Furthermore, compatibility is a condition for the emergence of mutual sympathy and acts as a prerequisite for team cohesion and conflict-free communication. And this is why companies describe their corporate culture and values and try to select people based on those values. That is, to prevent people with radically different values from joining and then conflicting. This is why teams, or rather companies, are starting to pay attention to people's interests. They organize activities, hobby groups, and start attracting people who are interested in various things. so that people find common ground and have a desire to work constructively. These are a few actions that companies take. It's also very important to understand the consequences of team conflicts, so there's an incentive to do something about it rather than letting it run its course. First, subgroups are formed as a result of conflicts. And it's important to understand. Let me ask this question. Please tell me, what is the purpose of a subgroup in a team? When a subgroup of people forms within a team, what do you think is the main goal? It may be explicit or implicit, conscious or unconscious, but it's always the same. What do you think? What's the main purpose, having a subgroup to team up against someone? So one opinion has been expressed. Please, what other options do you see? Think about it, someone else might have more ideas. Maybe someone has experienced this. Remember, I think we've encountered this at work when some groups have formed a general boycott. I had a team at the STB TV channel. I was a very young leader, both in age and experience, and an informal leader emerged who started forming a subgroup within my team, turning others against me. A kind of power grab, confronting another group, undermining someone to unite in comfortable hatred. Look, the main task of any subgroup is to destroy the main group. That is, any group that forms within a department, consciously or unconsciously, has one goal: to disrupt the larger team, to rebuild, to break it. Therefore, the formation of subgroups is always destructive. Next, the second consequence is removal, specifically the removal of dissenting members. That is, when there are non-constructive, destructive conflicts that aren't being addressed, they try to remove the dissenters. Next, scapegoating happens. If you know, I don't have it on my list, but there's a concept called the dictatorship of the minority. This is often how it happens. A few people, through conflicts, establish a dictatorship that forces the majority to submit to the opinion of the minority. Organizational changes in the group, that is, a change in the group's purpose, maybe a change in leadership. Organizational changes in a group, like a change in the group's purpose or leadership, can occur. So today I wrote a post in the Skyrocket T-chat, in the Skyrocket group. I had a situation like this. It was the first time I'd seen it. I joined the STB TV channel and worked there for 6 months. Then they tell me that an executive is quitting. He was very valuable, highly valued, very important. Of course, I try to figure out why he's quitting. It turns out he quit because of his team. He had formed the team, trained them, coached them. The team existed thanks to him, but it turned out that the team drove him out. He left because he was tired of working with them. They were toxic, they were disobedient, and he just quit on his own people. That's what happens sometimes. A change in the group's leadership style and the breakup of the group or team. Here, where it says group, you can substitute team. These are the negative consequences. In other words, if nothing is done about it, as we can see, nothing good comes of it. Next, there are conflicts between teams. There may be an objective conflict of interest here, and there may be a socio-psychological group phenomenon. Often in companies, a situation arises where one team is against another. You know, it's like neighborhood against neighborhood, wall against wall, like we are us and they are them, let's go against them. The origins of conflicts in organizations. A lot of things arise from production processes. That is, the business itself, the very workings of the company, is a source of regular conflict. Furthermore, this can often be due to difficult relationships between team members, especially between members of different teams. And it can also be rooted in the personality traits of the interaction participants. So everyone interacts differently, some are used to it. I had such a situation at the STB TV channel. We had one employee who was used to working in a very aggressive culture. And he was used to interacting very aggressively. Because of this, he entered into unnecessary and destructive conflicts with many people. In some ways, he achieved a lot thanks to this, but he created a lot of noise and harm around him. Until he adjusted and adapted. Then people started to like him. He became a superhero, you could say, but there were difficulties at first. These are the very origins of conflict. Causes leading to constructive conflicts. Conflicts aren't necessarily destructive. It's not necessarily something that you have to try to eliminate or suppress in some way. There are times when people are genuinely dissatisfied with something objectively and it needs to be fixed objectively. For example, dissatisfaction with pay is a constructive conflict. If the company objectively pays little, well, what did you expect? Unfavorable working conditions. There's a lot here. Inconvenient work schedules, technological shortcomings. In general, there's a lot that the company failed to organize properly, which can lead to conflicts. If all this is resolved, even the company will benefit from it. So you could say it like this. A constructive conflict is a conflict that the company wins by resolving. Well, look, for example, if the company improves the work schedule, it will be a more advantageous situation. It will be more attractive to employees, turnover will decrease, motivation will increase, productivity will increase, and so on. So this conflict, if you resolve it, will be beneficial for the company. The importance of constructive conflict is that the positive resolution of constructive conflict is, first of all, the elimination of the shortcomings that led to it. That is, through constructive conflicts, a company can address its shortcomings and improve the situation. And there can be destructive conflicts in an organization. These can be wrong actions by the manager, subordinates, or simultaneous actions of both the manager and subordinates. These are destructive conflicts and they need to be eliminated, eliminating the behavior itself, not some situation in the company. Managers' actions in conflict situations. Since we have an introductory class today, I still wanted to give some basic guidelines for those who are just listening and not yet taking the course. For those who will study in the course, we'll learn all these detailed algorithms there. A manager's action is to answer the questions, what should I do here? Where are the true causes of the conflict, when to take action, and how to behave? That is, 4 questions that a manager seeks answers to in order to resolve the conflict situation. As we said, you wrote about various home situations, that is, social factors that lead to conflicts. These are work and children, workers' neglect, mixing of personal and professional relationships, violation of the right to rest. All this also leads to conflicts. Conflict management means that since conflicts are destructive and harmful to the company, conflicts need to be resolved or even avoided. And only constructive conflicts, if responded to promptly, can be beneficial. How do you prevent conflicts? A technique called covert people management is suitable for conflict prevention. It's an approach that you may not even realize some people use to avoid creating conflict where it's not needed. This is an interaction where the goal is hidden from the addressee, but the addressee is given information based on which they make decisions planned by the initiator. One of the methodologies and techniques here is the proactive compliments method. So look, if someone compliments you at work or in work situations, it's likely that this person is trying to manipulate you. I have a salesman acquaintance. He's a very, very skilled salesman, probably the best salesman I've ever met. He often gives subtle and not so subtle compliments. Sometimes he even starts messaging me like, Mike, hey, I need your advice. You're the best in the country. I see. Basically, the person wants to manipulate, but he doesn't do it because he's some kind of villain. It's because salespeople spend their whole lives learning to do this. And it just becomes part of their life. But it works. Look, what's the key point here? The likelihood that a conflict will escalate largely depends on the emotional state of individuals and the overall atmosphere and relationships. And the best way to improve both is to give preemptive compliments. It's not the only way. In general, some companies constantly maintain a fun atmosphere, an atmosphere of enjoyment, relaxation, and entertainment. And it's really difficult for people to conflict there. When everything around is cool, everything is great. There's a beautiful office, events, parties, fruit and coffee in the kitchen. Everything's cool. It's hard to have conflicts. And conversely, when things aren't cool, it's easier to have conflicts. So it's important to understand that a compliment is neither flattery nor praise. It's a slight exaggeration of one of the recipient's virtues. When my acquaintance tells me I'm the best in the whole world or country, he's taking my virtue. I really am pretty good, but he magnifies it to some cosmic level. A compliment differs from flattery in that it's a slight exaggeration. He's not saying, listen, Mike, you're the best bodybuilder or runner. Obviously, that would be a complete lie because I run, but clearly not like athletes do. While a flatterer greatly exaggerates the virtues of the person they're talking to, this is usually called an irresistible compliment. Be sincere, try to make the compliment subtle, leave room for interpretation so the person can fill in some blanks themselves, base it on facts. Be concise, show empathy, and you can even give yourself an anti-compliment. Like, I can't seem to achieve this, but you're great at it, so please help me. Here are some types or examples of irresistible compliments. This is where I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll study this in the course. Again, Since the topic of conflict management is important to me, I want many people to understand it, because everyone benefits from the absence of destructive conflicts. So I decided to include such examples and tips so that those who only came to this webinar would also get something useful. There will be several examples here. I'll traditionally post this presentation in the Mach2 Academy chat on Telegram. So if you're not there yet, if you're not in the Mach2 Academy Telegram chat, find it and join. It'll be there. Basic approaches to conflict resolution. There are different options. You may have encountered this too. It can be a victory or win for one side, that is pure domination. It can be the cessation of conflicting actions without eliminating the underlying causes. This is called settlement. Or it can be a mutually beneficial solution where neither party sacrifices anything, called cooperation and integration. All of this can be learned. By understanding why conflicts happen and knowing the possible options, you can learn to manage them. Well, I've given you a few recommendations today as well. The homework for those in the course is to take any recent conflict you've observed, preferably one where you were a participant, and describe what conflict situations were involved and what the incident was, if any. Also consider how the conflict situations could be resolved so that the conflict is exhausted. That's the homework. The book, or rather the book and author I promised to name. On the topic of conflicts, I searched for a lot of information, studied different approaches. There's a lot of dry, purely technical information about conflicts. And there's only one author who caught my attention and whose approach I liked. The author I'm ready to recommend to you on this topic. It's Viktor Sheinov and his book Conflict Management. It can be easily bought on liters, please don't ask. Sometimes people come to the chat and say, who has the ebook? Look, on the Leaders website, any book is $5 or $6, that's 3 cups of coffee, you can afford it. So buy the licensed book if you want to read in more detail. For those already in the course, further lessons await you. In the next session, we'll study types of conflict. What we've briefly seen and studied today we'll dive deeper into, studying everything in more detail. We practice the homework in order that by the end of the course you'll know what to do to manage conflicts in a company. That's all. Thank you to those who were online, on Facebook. I'd appreciate it if you hit repost. On YouTube, those who watch, please like and subscribe to the Academy channel. And to everyone in the chat now, I would appreciate if you could write what was most valuable. Maybe you have some questions too. There is an opportunity to ask them now. So write those questions. It looks like we have Mike in the chat. Thank you very much. It is very interesting. You are welcome. Yes, that was my goal, to explain complex things in an interesting way. How to resolve a conflict between the director and HR. To quickly address this, analyze the conflict situation, understand why there is a conflict, find out its root cause. Maybe he is dissatisfied with something or does not trust them. Try to analyze and figure it out. For example, if there is a recent specific conflict that is difficult, break it down. What was the incident? What conflict situation preceded it? What exactly happened? Why is he in conflict with HR? That is my recommendation. And I should probably mention, for those in the course, we create individual student chat rooms for each course where we can discuss work situations and problems more openly in a private format. I can guide and advise you in these chats. HR is old, he is new, does not accept him. The director wants to work with the founders. So HR is old, he is new? That is understandable. Apparently, HR does not accept the director and wants to work with the founders. This is the conflict situation. It is a matter of status and roles. You can resolve this conflict by understanding that the company is still run by the director. Working with the founders is not an option. They can be stakeholders, but you need to build a working relationship with the director. You need to understand that there is a role. Whether you like the person or not is secondary. There is a role you need to work with. The solution to the conflict is to build an effective working relationship with the director as a role. Since you already have a director, you do not have other options. Take the most compatible approach and try to find common interests. Sometimes a person seems completely uninteresting or distant, but then it turns out that you have common interests. Maybe you're both into dogs, BMW cars, detective stories, or something else. And based on these common interests, you can build a relationship. Maybe you're from the same town. Maybe you graduated from the same university. Something along those lines. All right, friends, I won't keep you any longer. Thank you all very much for your interest in the webinar. Have a good evening, everyone. To the students of the course, see you in exactly 1 week. I look forward to your homework assignments. That's all. Bye-bye.